everyone, it's Sierra Verse, and I am on here doing my presentation for Analyzing Alice, and I am going to be looking at what Alice in Wonderland would have been like if it had been written during the 14th century. Also, it's more than likely going to be in the plague, because this is a time that was very tumultuous, and, well, it was not easy, and it was quite different from how Carol originally interpreted Alice, originally wrote Alice in Wonderland and interpreted the world around him and the culture. And it's very interesting, to say the least. So, life would be very different during the 14th century. The religious aspects, people were much more involved with the church than they are today. They would go to church several times a week. They would make sure to go to confession, and they would make sure to get their children baptized. It was very, very different. Manners, women, especially children like Alice, were taught to always be quiet and listen to the men of the household, or always listen to their elders. They were being trained, women were to be nuns or wives. And that was kind of the only two options they had, unless you were born into royalty, but even then your options were very, very limited, and there were very few queens who ruled during this time. Cats. We'll get more into depth about that, but let's just say cats were not as beloved as they are in Carol's views on what they would have been like in Victorian England. And like I said earlier, women's roles were basically you were a wife or a nun. You were there to produce children and sons for the men, and that was really it, other than attending to livestock and small plots of land. It was very dangerous to be a woman during this time, as many, many women died of childbirth. So cats. Cats were, no surprise, considered to be evil. They were thought to be the familiars of witches who were contracted by Satan to wreak havoc and turn people to sin so then they didn't get into heaven. So generally, people did not like cats during this time, and they kind of saw it as something evil. It's the same with snakes. They used to actually believe during the plague that if you chopped up a snake, and you rubbed it all over the body, that the evil of the snake would actually draw out the evil of the disease in the body and would cure the infected person. It's quite odd, but this was a time where not many things made sense. This is a time where they believed in unicorns, fairies, and all sorts of nonsense. Manners and education. Like I said earlier, Alice would have been brought up to be a wife or a nun and would always have to listen to her husband. And Alice actually more than likely would not have been able to read, as girls were not given an education during this time. Only men were. That is something that is very different compared to the original Alice in Wonderland, where it's referred to Alice getting lessons and getting an education quite often as she recites poems and many other things that were going on during this time. It was more important for girls and women in Victorian England to have the ability to read and write. However, during the 14th century, that was not the case, as oftentimes the only thing they might have been reading was the Bible. Women were not viewed very kindly back then, and it really shows. And now on to the fun part, where we get to hear my short story. It's not very good. I don't really think I'm that great of a writer, but I still hope that you kind of enjoy this different way of looking at Alice in Wonderland. So here we go. As Alice sat by the bedside of her sister, she grew very bored. All she could do was sit there and recite passages from the Bible to ease her sister's suffering. She knew that it was selfish to become bored. However, it was in the nature of a child that they would become bored after sitting in a single place for much longer than necessary. She looks at her sister's face, trying to ignore the stench that smelled like the chamber pots when they became full. The pus was oozing from the black lumps that covered her sister's armpits and groins, the telltale sign that she had been infected with the plague that was scourging their land. The stench was unbearable, and it hurt to see her sister, her only family, filled with pain. However, there was a part of her that wanted to run away, despite needing to be there for her sister's last rites. She knew that her sister was fading quickly from this world, and Alice knew that she needed to recite verses from the Bible in order to protect her sister's soul. The priest wouldn't be coming, and her parents were already gone. She was the only one her sister had left, and despite being so young, she did her best to recite the verses. However, she could not recall the verses that she needed to recite, which was, to say the least, very frightening to the young girl. However, Alice was the only one left in the house. The servants of the house had all run away from the house as soon as the pestilence had taken hold of their family. She leans down and begins to softly pray for her sister's soul. Eternal Father, I pray for my sister's soul and all souls who are in purgatory. I pray that if she does not... Alice hears a loud yowl, and she looks up to see a white cat sitting near her sister's head. The white cat was peculiarly dressed in a tunic and hat. It was quite strange enough that Alice had stopped her praying to stare up at the cat to see what it was doing. After a moment of thinking, Alice grew quite concerned about her sister. Cats were evil and thought to be the familiars of witches, or at times they were the witches themselves. The horrid thing had to be scouting her sister to curse her or steal her soul. She needs to get the cat out of the room and out of the house. She needs to protect her sister. You get away from my sister, you wretched thing, she yells as the cat takes off and towards the door. The cat disappears through the doorway, and Alice chases after it, determined to get the witch out of her house. Her sister didn't need a curse on top of the illness that had been plaguing their town. However, once Alice went through the doorway, she noticed that she was no longer in her house. She looks around the room she had found herself in, and is perplexed given that everything seems quite different than her home. In fact, none of the furniture even seemed to be from her time. Drapes hung from the windows, though when Alice tried to look through the window to see what was outside, all she could see was inky blackness. The walls were a light lavender color that made the dark wood of the table stand out, and the furniture was all sleek and oddly shaped candlesticks, or what she thought were candlesticks. However, upon closer examination, she noticed that rather than wax candles, they seemed to have odd little glass balls sitting inside them. Now, how is it that I have wound up in a room that I have never seen before? That is simply not possible unless magic is at work. She walks up to the small table in front of her. On the table sits a small bottle that seems to be made of the purest glass. The bottle itself, though, was filled to the rim with a purple liquid. Alice looks at the bottle suspiciously, unsure of what to think of something that clearly looked to be very expensive. Is this some kind of potion? She looks at it closely, examining it for any other indicator that might give her some sort of clue as to what this odd-looking drink actually does. When she finds nothing, she lets out a sigh. Well, I suppose that the only way I'm going to find out what it does is if I drink a little bit of it. She looks at it and then up at the ceiling, deciding to say a little prayer before taking a swig. Oh, Heavenly Father, what are you doing there, girl? Alice shrieks as she turns to look for where the voice came from. She whips her head around the room until she finds a door with two eyes above a ball-shaped handle and a mouth just under that. It was a rather small door, and it didn't go past her knees. Did you say that, my good sir? She looked at the door. The wood seemed to be a dark brown, but also very glossy. Alice didn't know how it was possible for the door to shine like the leather shoe of a nobleman. This simply had to be some kind of fairy, though she didn't know what kind. Though Alice knew that she needed to be careful, as fairies were known to spirit away children never to be seen again. She knew because her mother had often warned her of this when she went off with the older girls to the edge of the forest to gather berries. I said, "What are you doing, child?" comes the voice of what sounds like a grumpy old man. I do not know what exactly it is I'm doing, she says truthfully. Ultimately, how could a tiny door spirit her away? After all, she was quite a lot taller than it was, and it had no arms to carry her away. So how could her mother's advice be right in this case? I'm trying to find out where exactly I am, since I have never seen this room before. Well, how should I know where you are? You certainly are not in the same spot I am. You are completely lost, just like I am. There is no direction other than out. Alice rolls her eyes, deciding to ignore the strange door that was talking to her. Well, never mind that. I suppose I should go back to my sister. She turns towards the door, but the wall was smooth and seamless, as if there had never been a door there in the first place. What? She screams when she looks to the place that she was certain she had entered from. Where is the door? She runs to the place the door once was, and begins to frantically feel the area to see if she was just imagining this. No, no, no. What is wrong now? Have you gone mad now as well? It says, sounding not all that concerned, but it did sound a little amused at Alice's panic. The door that was here is gone, as if it vanished into thin air, but that simply can't be. Well, of course, it was busy and had other things to do. We don't have time to constantly help the same person. After all, you don't always do the same thing over and over, do you? I don't, but doors don't have things to do other than open in the spot they were placed. Her voice came out laced with panic. Doors couldn't move and leave on their own, could they? It simply was not possible. This door or fairy or whatever it was simply speaking nonsense. We most certainly do. We have to be ready to open at a moment's notice. Alice feels like she needs to scream loudly like a banshee, but she decides to take a deep breath instead and think a little bit more about her situation. I suppose there's only one way out, she says, looking at the door that was mumbling to itself now. But I'm much too large to fit through that door. She thinks back to the potion. Perhaps if I drink it, it will make me small enough to go through the door. Though I don't know how it could do that. I suppose I must never underestimate the power of a witch's potion. I need to find that white cat and get it to get me out of here. My sister doesn't have much time, and I need to make sure that her soul isn't carried away by demons. With a newfound determination, she stomps to the potion. She hadn't needed to stomp, but something about making the loud noise with her feet made her feel less afraid and more powerful. Alice scoops up the bottle and gets the cork out. Well, here goes nothing, she says as she tilts the bottle back and takes a small sip of the purple liquid. Well, I didn't think it would taste like apples. Alice had only really had apples during festivals and feasts that took place in the fall, when apples would be harvested from the orchards. They were her favorite treat. She looked at the bottle and couldn't help but take another swallow of the sweet liquid. After a moment, her body begins to feel rather strange, as if it were being pushed down upon and being forced to grow small. Well, this is peculiar, she observes as she watches herself shrink down to the perfect size for the door. Well, at least I'm the perfect size for you now, dear door. So long as you have the key, I suppose you could come through then if you truly wanted to. A key? She cries, looking at him. I didn't see a key anywhere. It's right up there on the other table. Alice looks to where the table is and groans as she sees the key sitting up there, part of it just hanging off the side so that it was visible to her. The placement of the key seemed to be taunting her now that it was out of her reach. How am I supposed to grow large again? She cries, feeling the tears welling up in her eyes. Suddenly, a small wooden box catches her eye as it sits on the floor under the table. Alice makes her way over to the box and opens it. What are these? She says, looking at them closely. The objects in the box appeared to be like the wafers Father John would give to the adults at the church. However, she was not entirely sure she should eat one, especially after drinking that odd potion earlier. God might punish it for her later. Have you never seen a wafer before? The door rolls its eyes. Try one. Go on. Eat it up. Alice looks at the wafer before picking one up and eating it. Her eyes widen as the taste fills her mouth. They tasted different than the wafers that Father John had given her, and rather they tasted like sweet cookies that her mother would make on special occasions. She couldn't help herself as she grabbed another one and popped it into her mouth with a satisfied grin. Alice begins to feel strange again, as if she's being pulled in all directions, and she begins to grow rather rapidly. Oh dear, if this keeps up, I shall become a giant, she cries out. She yelps as her head knocks against the ceiling, and she begins to sob as she looks at the door, completely forgetting about the key that was next to her on the table. Now I'm too big to fit through you, door. Whatever shall I do? Her tears stream down her cheeks, each droplet creating a layer of water to cover the floor. Oh, Heavenly Father, forgive me, for I have sinned. I overindulged, and now I have become a giant. I have fallen into a witch's trap and cannot find my way out again. I have abandoned my sister, and if I do not hurry, her soul will be cast to hell. Oh, Heavenly Father, please forgive me. She yells this as she continues to sob. By this point, the water was covering the mouth of the door. I know, I shall just drink more from that bottle, she says, her cries becoming more like sniffles. She lifts the bottle to her mouth and drinks it all down in a single gulp. She feels herself becoming smaller and smaller, and soon she finds herself in the water. Oh, Alice, what have you done? You've cried so much that you've created an ocean. She struggles to keep herself afloat as the waves roll around her. In a desperate attempt to get out of the water, she climbs into the bottle that was floating around her, and as soon as she's in it, begins to cough up the water that was in her mouth. Oh, dear me, I nearly drowned, she cries, looking around her. I need to stop crying so much. What would my sister say if she saw me? Or my mother and father? They would scold me for crying over nothing. The puddle was now moving rapidly toward the keyhole of the door. Now where am I going? She yells as the bottle is sucked out of the key world and into the unknown. And that's it for my short story. It feels a little bit more like a chapter, but maybe I'll continue it at some point. It still needs quite a lot of editing, but I hope you enjoyed it anyways. So just a brief little explanation of the different choices that I decided to make. I decided to change the white rabbit to a white cat because I felt like a white rabbit might not have concerned Alice enough to kind of get up and out of her seat and leave her sister. So I kind of needed her to be a little bit more driven to leave the room, especially given this time that people were very, very superstitious. They believed in unicorns, they believed in dragons, they believed in fairies. Hence her concern later on with the door talking and her thinking that, is this a fairy? Am I going to get spirited away? But in the end, she's just like, the door's too small and it doesn't have arms, so how could it possibly spirit me away given that it can't carry me? Logic. And I decided to kind of place this during the plague, mainly because I drew inspiration from what's going on in the world right now. As we know, it's the coronavirus, quarantine. And I was also taking a class on medical history and plagues, and I had recently done a paper on the Black Death, and I just got to thinking one day, what if Alice was set during this time? How would it be different? As you can tell, this Alice is also very much more concerned about what God thinks, as referenced by several of the prayers that she starts to say or does say during this time. She's a lot more concerned about her soul, as people were more concerned about the soul than the body, as many people died during this time. The average lifespan for a man was 28 years old, and the average lifespan for a woman was about 29 years old. And that was in rural areas. In cities, it was much, much lower. This is because they were very unsanitary, and they didn't have sewers, and they would just throw their poop and pee out into the streets. It was a fun time. But people were very superstitious, and I hope that kind of came across in Alice's, especially with the last rites when she was praying to save her sister's soul. They used to believe that in the end there was a final battle between Satan and the person over who was going to get their soul. So, that's why Alice was so concerned about being there to save her sister's soul and keep reciting Bible verses and saying prayers for her sister, and why she was like, the priest can't come, because usually a priest during this time period would come to the bed of the dying and would perform last rites, anointing of oils and holy water, and just making sure that they confessed and they were good and clear to go into heaven. That was their biggest concern, was that they needed to go to heaven. So I think I'm going to continue this story later on, probably over the summer. I think it's going to be a fun little project to work on when I'm not working, or maybe even when I'm working if I'm not busy. But I think I'd like to explore this world a little bit more, and kind of how Alice is different, and how the world of Wonderland is different than Carol's Wonderland. I would love to hear feedback from you guys. If you want to leave comments in the comment section down below, because I'm posting this to YouTube, or if you just want to send me an email, go right ahead. Otherwise, I hope you guys enjoyed my short little presentation.